Andretti, let's start there, wins the FIA's approval of a bid to become the 11th team on the grid. Now, obviously, this is certainly a big deal, but this doesn't mean that they are a shoo-in yet. So can you just walk us through the process? FIA has approved their bid, but then now the decision goes to Formula One and its media parent company, Liberty Media.
That's right. Yeah. So we've talked about this before, haven't we, on the pod? Quite a lot. It feels like, and it's something that's dragged on all of this year.
Yeah.
The very beginning of the year, President Ben Sulayem of the FIA opened up this process. He said we want to find an 11th and potentially a 12th team for Formula One. And if you remember, Andretti seemed to be his kind of chosen one from the beginning. There was all this back and forth between Michael Andretti, the teams. Andretti had come forward with this quite impressive sounding bid with Cadillac, with General Motors, and on the surface of it, you looked at it and thought, well, there's a lot to be excited about here. Formula One at the start of the year were very, very opposed to that. There's a lot of financial reasons for that. A new team coming in when Formula One is more popular than ever means that you're effectively, if a new team comes in, you're splitting 10 bits of a pie into 11. You can, I'm not the best at maths, but I can work out, or should I say, in this case, I'm not the best at math, considering we're talking about an American team. But you can tell that's not beneficial for everybody. So what happens with this process is fascinating, because the FIA has effectively spent the better part of this year doing due diligence on all of the bids. So last week we spoke about the New Zealand-based team Rodin, who had looked to enter with one female and one male driver. That obviously hasn't passed the criteria. They actually alluded to the fact in their statement that Andretti was very, very likely to be the only one put forward. So the FIA has gone through lots and lots of bids. I think it's around 7 or 8 that were actually submitted in a formal capacity. And they've looked at everything from the financial plan to the personnel plan. They'll have really, really honed in on details. And I hope to dig more into this week in the paddock. It's going to be fascinating to talk to people from the FIA and Formula One, because you always get, different parts of the story. But what is clear here, we've had different points where new teams have entered Formula One. 2010, 3 teams entered, and they were all bankrupt they were all off the grid, in a matter of years. Haas obviously joined in 2016. They're still going strong. They had some difficult years, but they've really established themselves well. From what I've been told from the FIA side, this has been a far more rigorous process than those 2 times put together and then some. So, you're talking about an order of magnitude of more scrutiny, into everything. And I think that's where this is interesting. So effectively what the FIA has done, for people listening, is they've presented to Formula One, who are, and to Liberty Media, who are the commercial rights holder, here's a team we think has everything you need to enter Formula One, passes all the checks and balances we as the governing body want to see from a new team. It's now up to you as the commercial rights holder, as the championship, to allow that team on the grid or not. And it's a fascinating situation, isn't it, Katie? Because we know there's a tension between those two bodies, as as this fascinating dynamic in Formula One always is. FIA has now, if you're talking about a tennis match, I watched King Richard on the plane over here, the movie about the Serena and Venus Williams. So got tennis on my mind at the moment. But they've effectively pushed F1 to the very back of the court. They're in a very, very defensive position now, because it's going to be very difficult, I think, for them to turn around and reject this bid out of hand, as we can get into a bit more. But Andretti and the FIA right now, if you're either of them, I think you're feeling pretty good about it.
I thought you were going to say the ball is now in your court, Formula One.
I was trying to think of the phrase, and I was like, there's too many ways to slip up and make that a very embarrassing sentence. So I just thought I'll leave it alone. So I went for the other one.
So the ball is in Formula One's court at this point in time. So I think it's interesting. You have the governing body, and then you have the 10 teams. Do the 10 teams get a say? Is there a vote? It has to be unanimous? Like, how does that work? Because we know that some of these teams are lukewarm to the idea, as you mentioned prior, because they're wary of diluting the overall kind of pot of revenue, right? And also, as it currently stands, it's a $200 million entry fee to join.
That's right.
Is that going to possibly change? Because some of the teams feel like, well, $200 million at the current valuation is too small of an amount as compared to what it maybe should be.
Yeah, absolutely. So that fee is the dilution fee. And that was agreed quite a long time ago now, for any new team to come in. And what it was meant to do, that 200 million was meant to be spread between the 10 teams, and basically cover the loss from from 10 bits of the pie to 11. Now, because Formula One teams right now are making more money than they ever have before, they all feel like that dilution fee should be a lot higher than that. So I think that is going to be one of the big sticking points. I think that teams, I get the impression that what will happen now is that Formula One is slowly going to have to bring the teams on board here, because Andretti, I think, and the FIA can probably go down a legal route now. If the bid is blocked, do you start to run into antitrust issues? Do you start to run into all kinds of legal problems down the line? Because effectively, I'm not a legal expert here, but that's some of the things that people have been talking about over the last 24 hours. So it's going to be really fascinating. But you're right; those are the concerns the teams have. As far as I know, this is something that Liberty Media will deal with as a one-off thing, but they're never going to agree to it if there's, say, 5 teams that aren't on board or 3 teams not on board. They're going to want a unanimous view from everybody. So even though there isn't a one checkbox vote from every team, effectively they all have a say. And it's going to be interesting now to see how the politics play out, because if you remember, Alpine have already said that. So the Cadillac part of it does sound, on the surface, when you hear it, you're like, that sounds like they're providing an engine. From what we heard at the start of the year, they're just going to put a badge on the car. Now, that might not be the case. We might hear differently this week, because that might be something, if Cadillacs decide to invest a bit more money into that, that might be why the FIA has actually pushed this over and said, look, another engine manufacturer coming in 25 or 26. Obviously, we have Audi coming in. I have a feeling that maybe there's a slightly stepped up involvement from Cadillac. Again, I haven't had that confirmed, but that the fact that we've got Andretti on the table and we don't have any of these other teams on the table would suggest that. But if that isn't the case, Alpine have already said they will, which is obviously Renault, will supply an engine. So you start to get a fascinating politics dynamic here, where Renault will look at it and say, well, this is a chance for us to have a customer team. Other teams may look at it and say, well, we're not getting enough on the dilution fee, or, politically, this is bad for us. So it's going to be a really fascinating couple of months, and pretty consequential, because this is the first time Formula One's had to deal with this situation since Haas joined the grid. And now, especially with where F1 is in America, more eyeballs on it than ever. And if you remember at the start of the year, Michael Andretti called the F1 teams greedy when they kind of were lukewarm to his approaches. It's going to be very difficult for Formula One not to look like that, even if they feel like they have justified reasons for not letting a team on, because it all comes down to the financial side of it. And so it's a really fascinating one from a PR perspective, how things have shifted around, and now Formula One are kind of on the back foot a bit. And as you say, the ball is very much in their court.
Netflix, just make sure you're in the room.
Yeah,
we would love to see that go down.
I think Michael Andretti is going to be. We have I don't know if you guys have this phrase. You probably don't. Of grinning like a Cheshire cat.
Yeah, I think it comes from you guys, but yes.
Yeah, it sounds, as I said it, I was like, that's definitely one of the most English phrases that I've ever said. But I can imagine Michael Andretti doing that right now, because there was a time a few months back where it didn't seem too likely that this was going to go anywhere. We heard about all this whole process that was going on, and it just didn't seem like we were going to get to a resolution with this, or to the point we have got to. The FIA has, I think, similar to what they did with the budget cap, they said we'd rather take a longer time with it and make sure we've got everything in place, and then release the press release they did this week. So yeah, we'll see what the next steps are. But this is now the hot topic in Formula One, for the next months until it's resolved, because this could, in theory, sorry, Katie, rambling on this, but in theory, Andretti could join the grid in 2025.
That was my next question. Timeline wise, where are we?
So if F1 somehow manages to agree very, very quickly, I think probably by the end of this calendar year at the very latest, Andretti probably could come in for 25.
Wow.
I don't see the benefit from them of doing that, because they'd have to build one car, and then in 26 the regulations change again, and they'd have to effectively build a completely new one. I've heard some teams question the logic of 25, some of the existing teams. So 26 seems the most likely time. But if you're Michael Andretti as well, you're probably keen to get in as quickly as you can and kind of, establish yourself as a team, get your operations up and running. Crucially, they want to operate out of Banbury in the UK. So early on, there was talk of will they be based in the US? And I think another thing that came out of the FIA, and actually I'm hoping to see the FIA president, in a media session this week. I want to ask him, is it impossible now for any prospective teams to be based outside of Europe? Because initially the talk was maybe they'll be based in the US. Obviously, Rodin, who we spoke about earlier, wanted to be based in New Zealand. I think with the logistics of Formula One, with the freight, with the employees, etc., you've got everyone else based in Europe. I can't see how you can realistically do it if you're not there. So I think that as well might be another thing that's changed over the past kind of 6 or 7 months for Andretti.
New Zealand was hard to wrap your head around logistically being able to overcome that. So it makes sense that they'd want to be located over in Europe to that point. And then the last note before we hit our preview for Qatar, do you feel like there will be a need, a want, a desire for an Andretti team to have an American driver in its lineup?
I do. And Michael Andretti said that previously. I think he's gone on record a few times and said one of the things he wants to do. I mean, he's tried before. He tried to buy Sauber a few years ago, and he was very, very keen at the time to enter with Colton Herta. Obviously, Herta's still somebody who has talked about a lot. Pato O'Ward's not American, but he's a Mexican driver, but doing very, very well in IndyCar over the past few years. And of course, Alex Palou, who if you look at his situation realistically, he's burnt a few bridges with McLaren recently. So one of his only ways into Formula One now would be with an Andretti style team. So I think if there's a possibility, and again, it comes down to super license points, because remember, AlphaTauri, before they had the disastrous Nick De Vries experiment, they wanted to get Colton Herta in that car for this season. He didn't have the super license points for that. But I think if Andretti is in a situation where he can put an American in the car, I think he'll go for it. And that's I think although Haas is an American team, I think if Andretti Cadillac does come in, it will very much feel like this is an American team for that reason. They'll lean more into that than the Haas team has. Obviously, haven't had an American driver for the entire time they've been in, and have actually been quite kind of negative when asked about that question, like, well, why would we have an American driver? And I think Michael Andretti is like, well, why wouldn't we have one? So yeah, I'd be surprised if Andretti came in with two drivers that weren't from, or at least one driver that wasn't from the US.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube, and for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app, and for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.